meet you all in a minute as we get started here in a second. So I hope it's a nice day up in Darien. It's a gorgeous day here in southern Westchester today, and it's been a gorgeous week. I walked on the Hudson the other day. It was 54 degrees. We still had snow, and it was just gorgeous looking at the cliffs. And I looked at it and I said, hey, that's it. We're not going to have this anymore this year. And sure enough, it's going. But all is good. And hopefully we'll see you all in 6 weeks in the venue. Got another minute. So we'll just wait. I'm going to mute everybody here. And yeah, you know the rules of the game here. If you have anything to say, go ahead. Feel free to either type it into the box or to, if you don't want to type it into the box, just raise your hand and we'll get around to it. And I do know that you all were around in 1960 when this thing started. So I'm gonna, okay, it's 2 o'clock, so let's get moving here. And thank you, Patty, for inviting me. And hello, everybody up in Darien, Connecticut today. It must be a really nice day, so thank you for spending time with me. We are talking about the calendar year 1960, which really was the start of the sexual revolution in the United States. I'll get around to that in a minute. But a number of weeks ago, I was sitting around on a Saturday morning and I was watching television, Buzzer TV, old game shows. And on the screen came The Price is Right with Bill Cullen. And I'm watching the show and I'm looking at all the prizes they're giving away. And it dawns on me that every one of the companies that was giving a prize away, not everyone, but just about everyone was out of business, and they were all in the Midwest, whether it was Indiana or Ohio or Michigan, Illinois. And I started thinking about what happened to American industry. And there were other things as I was watching the show. And I said, you know what, this is kind of interesting to me. I was only 3 years old at the time, or 4 years old at the time. And I said, hey, let's go back and let's take a look. And I found there are similarities between the calendar year 1960 and the calendar year 2020 that just ended now 2 months ago. And let's talk about some of the things that happened. That is a Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. And those people sitting at that particular counter in Greensboro, North Carolina at the Woolworths were denied the right to eat there. They just were told you can't eat there. That starts the sit-in part of the civil rights movement, ushers in a new part of the civil rights movement starting in February of 1960, February 2nd. Fidel Castro is really entrenching himself as the leader of Cuba. The Cold War is going on. The United States, the Soviet Union, and that is the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, who was captured by the Soviets and added to the Cold War in 1960. The United States, rather the, I gotta mute everybody here, hang on. Okay, the USSR and Red China. Red China and the USSR, their relationship is fraying at the seams. And that is Mao Zedong on the left and Nikita Khrushchev on the right. The presidential race of 1960, John Kennedy on the left and Richard Nixon on the right. And I'm just going to put this in editorially. I got to know Richard Nixon starting in 1985 over a 4 or 5 year period. And he was as quirky as can be, but he knew my name. I knew his name. He lived in Park Ridge, New Jersey. And the reason I got to know Richard Nixon was he was brought in, I was covering sports at the time, sports business, and he was brought in to be the arbitrator of the dispute between the Major League Baseball owners and the umpires who wanted more money. And it was suggested that Richard Nixon do the arbitration. He did, and he comes back into society, proper society, as an elder statesman in 1985 as a result of that. It was the year of independence in Africa. 18 countries became countries, no longer colonies in Africa. And the business of America was the business of America. There you see a 1960 Chevrolet. What was good for General Motors was good for the country, or was it? we'll talk about that in a minute. Also, the business of America, U.S. Steel out of Pittsburgh. It used to be steel mills and autos and coal mining, all in that center part of the country, or that part of the country, the Rust Belt part. And Elvis goes back to civilian life. Culturally, over about a 4-month period, America changes culturally. Elvis goes back to civilian life. Cassius Clay wins a gold medal. The Beatles become the Beatles in 1960. And Hawaii becomes a state, the 50th state. What aloha means on Maui Isle. I've been to Maui a few times. Aloha means, do you have money and are you ready to spend it? Because the prices there are out of sight. Well, out of sight would come later on in the 60s. So let's get back to these 4 guys. They're in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they go into a Woolworths. And I remember as a kid in Woolworths, yeah, there were lunch counters there, but I remember the smell of Woolworths. You were there, and you could get anything you want in Woolworths. You could get a bobbin, you could get a bobby pin, you could get a pair of scissors, or you could get a pair of shoes. You could get what you want at Woolworths. 5 and dime and all that other stuff. These 4 guys wanted to eat, and they were refused service. It is February 1st, 1960, the Woolworth protest. 4 African-American students, Ezekiel Blair, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond sit down at a lunch counter at the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and were politely asked for service. They were turned down. They were refused, and they were asked to leave. They remained in their seats. Their passive resistance and peaceful sit-down demand helped ignite a youth-led movement to challenge racial equality throughout the South. The one of the last people who was around from that era passed away last year, John Lewis, the congressman from Georgia. But these 4 set into motion the next phase of the civil rights movement in the South. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is formed at Shore University in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's attended by 126 delegates from 58 sit-in centers in 12 states, 19 northern colleges, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was Martin Luther King's conference, the Congress for Racial Equality Corps, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the National Student Association, and the Students for a Democratic Society, which was a white group, which was formed out in California. SNCC was headed up by John Lewis, the congressman who passed away last year. And take a look at this picture. There is Julian Bond in the front, one of the leaders of the group. John Lewis is back there with the glasses in the second row. One of the first interviews I ever did as a journalist was back in around 1978 with Julian Bond. And he was at Rockland Community College giving a talk, and I did the interview with him afterwards, a one-on-one interview, which I found kind of interesting. Here I am, I'm 21 years old at the time, and he's talking about his past in the South and being part of the student group, also not being seated after he was elected to the Georgia State Senate about 5 or 6 years afterwards, and his work as a civil rights leader. So I got to interview him in 1978. I didn't run into him after that, but I still have the article that I did with Julian Bond, and it was one of the first interviews I ever did professionally. SNCC. These are the people who were part of SNCC. Diane Nash, Marion Barry, who would eventually become the Washington mayor, John Lewis from Fisk University, and American Baptist Theological Seminary students, including James Bevell and Bernard Lafayette, all involved in the Nashville student movement. Their mentor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville was James Lawson. Charles F. McDew led student protests at South Carolina State University, J. Charles Jones, John Smith University in North Carolina, Julian Bond, Morehouse College in Atlanta, and the name that would be more associated with violence in the late 1960s Stokely Carmichael from Howard University, that in Washington, D.C. Another Civil Rights Act was signed on May 6, 1960. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 was aimed at strengthening and covering loopholes in the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And what they did, well, federal inspection of local registration polls by appointed referees to oversee Southern elections and ensure African Americans were permitted to vote, penalties for anyone obstructed someone's attempt to register to vote or vote, prosecution for interfering with court orders regarding school desegregation. There is Martin Luther King in 1960, and he's only 31 years old at this point in 1960. And the civil rights movement and presidential politics of 1960 would intersect in Atlanta in October of that year. October 19th, 52 people, including Martin Luther King, were arrested in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, after refusing to leave their seats at the segregated rich department store lunch counters. Under the Jim Crow segregation laws, Negroes were banned from being served at department store lunch counters. And they're all arrested. Charges against 16 of the 51 protesters would eventually be dismissed, but the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was held on charges that his arrest violated a term of state probation imposed on him earlier that year. After Martin Luther King was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor, the presidential candidate, John F. Kennedy, reached out to the King family and helped secure Dr. King's release. Cynical or not, would it help John Kennedy with the election just about 3 weeks away or not? Well, that remains to be answered by historians years and years from now when they look back at the 1960 presidential election. But obviously, if Kennedy is trying to release Dr. King in the middle of the civil rights movement, that must mean that Kennedy is looking for votes from there. You probably have never heard of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was 6 years old in 1960. She is now 67 years old. She's still around. And at the age of 6, Ruby Bridges is a civil rights pioneer. She's 6 years old, and she advances the cause of civil rights in the South in November of 1960, when she becomes the first African-American student to integrate an elementary school in the South, in New Orleans. The first day she's going to school in New Orleans, she walks past crowds screaming slurs at her. She spent the first day in the principal office because of the chaos created. Angry white parents pulled their children from the school. Segregationists withdrew their children permanently. They couldn't go to that elementary school because 6-year-old Ruby Bridges is there. And it wasn't just her going to school that impacted the family negatively. It was more than just her. Her father, Abon, lost his job. Grocery stores refused to sell to her mother, Lucille. She had sharecropping grandparents who were evicted from the farm where they had lived for a quarter of a century. This was a major, major shock to the system of Jim Crow New Orleans that 6-year-old Ruby Bridges would end up going to school. It turned out that there was a white teacher from Boston who moved to New Orleans named Barbara Henry, and she was Ruby's teacher all year. It was a class of one, Ruby along with her teacher. Ruby ate lunch alone, sometimes just played with her teacher at recess, but she never missed a day of school that year. About 30 years later, she was reunited with Barbara Henry, and for a time, they went on speaking engagements together talking about that year, 1960, when Barbara Henry was Ruby's only teacher. Norman Rockwell, from Saturday Night Post fame, was not allowed to commentate with the Saturday Night Post on social situations or the civil rights movement in America. But in 1964, he was freed of that. And he put out this painting that he did of Ruby Bridges going to school in 1960. The painting is called 1964, the problem we all live with. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover is looking for communists in San Francisco. I mean, wherever they could find communists, well, hey, let's go find them. And that's San Francisco City Hall. And you could see that there are people who are either sitting on the steps or has slid down the steps trying to walk up the steps or down the steps because they greased the skids in San Francisco. Now, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, which started way back when in the 1950s, and among others, they got was Hazel Scott, who was on the Dumont TV network every week. Back in 1950-51, she was accused of being a communist, and she decided to go in front of the committee and say, I'm not a communist. She was on Dumont Network. All her sponsors pulled out of her Monday night 15-minute show weekly, and she was not on TV anymore. She fled over to Europe, where she had a career, and came back in 1970 on General Hospital, the soap opera on ABC. So, House on Un-American Activities, UAC, held hearings in San Francisco. That was May 12th through 14th to investigate alleged communist subversion. Now, in 1959, the House on Un-American Activities subpoenaed San Francisco Bay Area journalists, college professors, 110 public school teachers, and then leaked their names to the local press. But they did not have the hearings because people in San Francisco didn't want to hear anything about it. In 1960, they decided, yeah, we're going to have those hearings again. And they were greeted by hundreds of peaceful protesters, mostly college students, who formed a picket line around the San Francisco City Hall. Was there a riot? Well, if you read the local newspapers of the day, there was a riot. But there's some question about whether there was a riot or not, and if it was, who caused it? There is a water cannon being fired at the demonstrators on the streets of San Francisco. I think that was an old TV show, The Streets of San Francisco. May 13th, a police riot squad turned on fire hoses on protesters in the Rotunda without warning, inspired by the recent lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro and other places. The protesters sat down and sang, we shall not be moved. Some of them were washed down that marble staircase. Others were dragged by their feet, bumping their heads on every step. The local and national news media called it a riot, blamed it on the protesters. In response to the media, 5,000 people turned out to the final day's protest. Out of this protest, there's a legacy that would come back in the late 1960s at Columbia University in, say, 1967, 68. There's a group at the University of California, Berkeley, or as it's known out there, Berkeley. It was called SLATE, student group. And they, along with some civil rights groups and labor leaders, organized the San Francisco protest. It was during this protest that would spark the students to demonstrate at Berkeley during the 1960s. Tom Hayden, one of the Chicago Seven, who disrupted the Democratic National Convention in 1968. Well, Tom Hayden was, in 1962, organizing the Students for Democratic Society. He conferred with SLATE during this intervention and would form the Students for Democratic Society, a group that would eventually shut down Columbia University in 1968. Havana, Cuba. Cuba was the playground for Americans. They went to Havana, they could gamble, they could have a good time on the beaches. And other Caribbean islands like St. Martin saw, hey, there's a lot of American money going to Cuba. Hey, maybe we should start building some infrastructure here at our island to get some of that American money. Well, Fidel Castro cut off that American money in 1959. Here he is with his group that took over Cuba. In 1959, Castro established a socialist state after he and a group of guerrilla fighters successfully revolted against Batista. Batista was the dictator who had been supported by the US government, also the mafia and US businesses, for his anti-communist stance. But he would flee the country in 1959. Castro was looking at the United States and figured out the United States wanted no part of his philosophy. And he looks out and reaches out to Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. And he gradually strengthens the relationship with the Soviets, which means that the United States, looking at Cuba about 90 miles off the coast, isn't too thrilled, and something has to be done. Dwight Eisenhower is the president of the United States at this point, and he realizes that Fidel Castro is a major problem. In 1960, Castro nationalized all foreign assets in Cuba. He hiked taxes on U.S. imports. They needed U.S. imports. And he would establish trade deals with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower retaliates by slashing the import quota of Cuban sugar, freezing Cuban assets in the United States. He imposes a nearly full trade embargo and cuts off diplomatic ties with the Castro government. I had a friend by the name of Jose Valdivieso. He was on TV, Channel 47, WNJU in New York, the Spanish TV station. And we formed a friendship in the 1980s. I'd see him all the time into the 1990s. And he would tell me about how great Cuba was when he was growing up. And Valdivieso signed a contract to play Major League Baseball or to play baseball with the Washington Nationals, Washington Senators organization. And I was talking to Valdivieso because some historians say, well, you know, this could have been a little different if Fidel Castro was signed by a major league team and Castro could become a pitcher. Washington was signing a lot of Cuban players, including Valdivieso, Camilo Pascual, and Tony Oliva, and a whole bunch of others. They were good players, too. And I talked about Valdivieso, who went with Washington to Minnesota when the team moved in 1961. I said, tell me about Fidel as a pitcher. And he hated Fidel. I mean, Jose absolutely hated Fidel because he never got back to his home country, never got to see his family again. Really, never got to do anything. Settled in New Jersey after his baseball career was done and was on TV. So I said, what kind of player was Fidel? And could history have been changed if he become a baseball player? And he says, no. He says, everybody who had a baseball glove, literally anybody who had a baseball glove, got a tryout for a major league team. He said there was a scout by the name of Cambria who looked at everybody, and he knew who could play and he knew who couldn't play. And he said Fidel couldn't play. So he said Fidel went into law and other things and then eventually would take over the island. In terms of baseball, on July 8th, Fidel Castro ended the American League ownership of minor leagues AAA Havana International League baseball team. It was Cincinnati Reds' top affiliate. The Sugar Kings of Havana moved to Jersey City, New Jersey, where they played for a year and a half. They were known as the Jersey City Jerseys. That was the extent of what Castro was doing, throwing out American companies or throwing them off the island. After Castro's decision to sign a trade treaty with the Soviet Union, the Eisenhower administration began financing and training a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow the Cuban leader. John Kennedy would use those Cuban exiles in 1961 in the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. Castro responded to Eisenhower beginning to train Cuban exiles by increasing his program of nationalizing foreign property and companies. Cold War? Oh, I remember the Cold War. Some of you might too. I remember this. Remember when you covered and ducked, or ducked and covered, and you went underneath the desk and tried to avoid getting killed with a nuclear fallout after the nuclear bomb would be dropped? Well, there is Nikita Khrushchev, Life magazine, and he's in Paris, and the Cold War is taking place, and the Americans and the Soviets and the English and French were supposed to meet in Paris to see if they could sort out any of their differences that have taken place since the end of World War II, 15 years earlier. But you know, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, and this one goes awry. On May 1st, the Soviets shoot down an American U-2 reconnaissance jet flying over the Soviet territory. Since June of 1956, Dwight Eisenhower had approved secret flights over Soviet territory because he wanted to see whether or not the Soviets had gained missile superiority over the Americans. If you remember the 1960 presidential campaign, John Kennedy, one of his big planks was the missile gap. Was there a missile gap? Well, we don't know. We still don't know to this day whether there really was a missile gap between the Soviets and the Americans back in 1960. Not knowing that the Soviets had captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, and gotten the confession confirming his spy mission. He was supposed to kill himself. He didn't. Eisenhower claimed the aircraft was merely a weather plane. Khrushchev presented the pilot as proof that Eisenhower had lied. And there is the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, who was released in 1962 after 2 years of being captive or being captured. On May 5th, Khrushchev told the Supreme Soviet of the USSR that the American spy plane had been shot down on May 1st and referred to the flight as an aggressive act by the United States. On May 7th, Khrushchev revealed that the pilot of the plane, parachuted to safety, was alive, was in Moscow, and testified he took off from Pakistan to fly across the Soviet Union and then go back to Norway, and he's collecting all kind of intelligence information as he was flying. And he worked for the CIA. So there was supposed to be this summit talk between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, and boy, that guy behind, in between Eisenhower and Khrushchev makes, there's no ifs, ands, and buts. He is from the USSR. He even has a little card on his lapel, USSR. So on May 16th, we're supposed to have this big summit talk with the Americans and the British and the French. And Khrushchev says, hey, look, we're not going to be there unless you stop these flights. Don't spy on us anymore. And apologize for the ones that you've already done and punish the people who were responsible for this. Eisenhower said, okay, I'll suspend flights during the remainder of his presidency. He's going to be gone by January 20th, 1961. But Khrushchev wasn't happy. And it's all over. May 17th, gone. We're out of here. No more summit. And Eisenhower's planned trip to Moscow in June of that year, that's gone. Back to duck and cover, right? Duck and cover. Remember hanging out underneath the desks? So the summit collapses. Khrushchev and Eisenhower really wanted to ease Cold War tensions. Starting in 1957-58, there was actually a cultural exchange between the two countries. But the easing of the Cold War tensions never came about because of the U-2 incident. Powers was tried and convicted of espionage, 10 years in prison. He's released in 1962 in exchange for the Soviet spy Rudolf Abel. On September 8th, the beginning of the Berlin Wall starts, when the German Democratic Republic, or better known as the Soviet satellite East Germany, limited access to the East Berlin area for West Berliners, and the wall would eventually go up. Sino-Soviet split. There's Khrushchev to the left, Mao Zedong to the right, and they don't like each other by 1960. Mao Zedong, Stewie Gates, my old social studies teacher from 9th grade, 1969, 1970, he's still around. He was fighting fires until about 7-8 years ago in Stony Point, New York, a volunteer fireman, until they said, Stewie, don't go up the ladders anymore. You're in your 80s. You don't have to do it. Anyway, Mao Zedong from Red China or Communist China, which Stewie Gates impounded in our brains back in 1969-70. The love affair between the two guys, which really never was, well, it sours by now. Mao was in his 12th year of leading Communist China at that point. He took over in 1949. And Red China is not very happy. Khrushchev loses face with the People's Republic of China, or Communist China, or Red China, because he didn't punish the United States enough over the U-2 incident, and that causes a rift between the Soviets and the Red Chinese. But the rift really starts in 1958-59 because Mao Zedong did not like seeing that Eisenhower and Khrushchev are doing this cultural exchange. There was a hockey team sent over to Moscow, track and field team sent over to Moscow, and Khrushchev sent the dancing bears from the Moscow circus. I used to love watching the dancing bears in the Moscow circus on Ed Sullivan. Who wouldn't? See these bears dancing and all that other stuff. He also sent the Bolshoi ballet over to the United States. So, there's this cultural exchange. Mao doesn't like it. And then he criticizes Tito and Yugoslavia because they're too close to the United States or trying to cozy up to the United States, which in turn, Khrushchev criticizes Albania because Albania is siding with Mao Zedong. So within the communist world, there are all kinds of rifts, which by 1969 could have became deadly and almost caused the Soviets to drop a nuclear bomb on Red China in 1969. So there's a meeting in Bucharest, Romania, November of 1960, international meeting of communist and workers' parties. And there, Mao and Nikita Khrushchev are there, and they're attacking each other. Mao's attacking the Soviet interpretation of Orthodox Marxism, while Khrushchev is doing the same about Mao Zedong, and they're both talking about it's the wrong road to take if you want to get socialism in the world, that you can't, both of them are arguing which road to take. Mao said that Khrushchev's emphasis on consumer goods and material plenty would make the Soviets ideologically soft and unrevolutionary, to which Khrushchev replied, if we could promise the people nothing except revolution, they would scratch their heads and say, isn't it better to have good goulash? I don't know, is that good goulash or not? Here's some goulash. On August 13th, 1960, the USSR has had enough of China and they withdraw advisors from China. Meanwhile, you spying on us? You spying on us? Apparently the Soviets had been spying on the US using that. It's a wall plaque. The Great Seal Bug. The US ambassador to the United Nations, this is May 26, 1960, Henry Cabot Lodge unveiled the Great Seal Bug before the UN Security Council to counter Soviet denunciations of the American U-2 espionage. The Soviets had presented a replica of the Great Seal of the United States as a gift to Ambassador Averell Harriman in 1956. The gift hung in the US Embassy for many years until 1952. While George Kennan was the ambassador to the Soviet Union, they decided to take a look at the seal, and they found a listening device in the US Embassy. Lodge's unveiling of this Great Seal before the Security Council in 1960 provided proof that the Soviets also spied on the Americans. That's where Mad Magazine probably came up with Spy vs. Spy. I used to live as a kid on Mad Magazine, and undercut a Soviet resolution before the Security Council denouncing the United States for its U-2 espionage missions. But it's all about the shoes, it's all about the shoes. There is Nikita Khrushchev. He's at the United Nations, and he's threatening to bury the United States, or his form of communism is eventually going to bury the United States. And he gets a reputation as a hothead here because apparently he kind of banged his shoe on the table at the UN in New York, but he really didn't, but it looked like he did. October 12th, something happened. Khrushchev pounded his fist on the table, according to some reports, removed his shoe, threatens to pound the table with his shoe in protest of a speech critical of Soviet policy in Eastern Europe. Now, the General Assembly President Frederick Bolin of Ireland breaks his gavel, calling the meeting to order. And Khrushchev, because he may or may not have, he did pick up the shoe, but he didn't bang it, but his image becomes that of a hot-headed buffoon. Khrushchev's daughter, Nina, recounted a different story. She said that he removed his shoe because he was wearing the latest in Soviet fashion. He was wearing a new tight shoe. When he pounded the table, his watch fell off, and he was picking it up. He noticed his shoes and used them. But John Longard of Life magazine, who was in the General Assembly, noted that Khrushchev didn't really bang his shoe on the desk, but he certainly did mean to do so. And so Khrushchev becomes this buffoon in front of the world, playing with his shoe at the United Nations. Oh, I could have been one of those people. In fact, I was one of those people. Maybe you were too. I'm going to be 65. I remember this great. I remember my teachers go underneath. I said, why? Go underneath. Well, if they drop a bomb, what's the big deal? They're going to get me, you know, so why don't I stand up? Why should I be so uncomfortable? Duck and cover, duck and cover. That was so uncomfortable. You were under the desk. Why were you under the desk? They couldn't tell me. But apparently I looked it up later on in life, because duck and cover is a method of personal protection against the effects of a nuclear explosion. Duck and cover is useful at conferring a degree of protection to personnel situated outside the radius of a nuclear fireball, but still within sufficient range of a nuclear explosion that standing upright and uncovered is likely to cause serious injury or death. If you're in the middle of a nuclear fireball, you might as well stand up. It's not going to protect you, but that was it. And we used to have duck and cover drills in school. Hated them. Absolutely hated them. You had to go on the floor and contort yourself under the desk. Duck and cover. Part of my childhood. Vietnam in 1960. Well, yeah, there were Americans in Vietnam in 1960. The United States was in the region conducting operations in Laos. They thought Laos and the Laotian government was a bigger problem than the civil war that was going on between North Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh and Diem and South Vietnam. They thought Laos was the thing that they had to button down. There was also something else called the Domino Theory, that if Laos goes and South Vietnam goes and Thailand's going to go and all these countries are going to go, Cambodia, and they're going to go all communists. They go down like dominoes. In 1960, 3,500 American soldiers are sent to Vietnam. On November 12th, the first of many coup attempts against the South Vietnamese President Diem, that one failed. On December 20th, and this would go on through the 1960s. As you might remember, casualties at dawn, how many Viet Cong were killed and wounded. December 20th, Southern revolutionaries who were not in love with President Diem in South Vietnam, backed by the North Vietnamese Communist Party, formed the National Liberation Front, known in Saigon and Washington as the Viet Cong. And of course, in the 60s, you would hear an awful lot about that. The presidential race. Oh, I didn't win. I didn't win. John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Guys who knew each other since 1947, when they both entered Washington as congressmen. Nixon from California, Kennedy from Massachusetts. There was a whole bunch of people. There were a whole bunch of people that were campaigning in 1960 for the Democratic nomination, including Kennedy from Massachusetts, a senator, Governor Pat Brown of California, the United States Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri, the United States Senator and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson from Texas, the former Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, who lost to Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956. Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, and Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey. Eventually, JFK would prevail and would choose Lyndon Johnson as his running mate, Lyndon being the powerful senator from Texas, and also Kennedy was looking to shore up the South, even though JFK and Lyndon Johnson couldn't stand each other, as we found out later on. In 1959, Nixon decides he's going to run. He's the vice president, after all. He could succeed Eisenhower. And he puts his foot in the water in 1956, and so does Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller, the New York governor, and he was the leader of the Republican moderate liberal wing. But Rockefeller went out there and stuck his toe in the water and put his finger in the air to see which way the wind was blowing. And he found out that Nixon's the one, and Nixon would be the one. So he drops out. The issues, well, the issues were because America was even though it was in a recession, America was still running well in the Rust Belt economically. The auto industry was still good. The steel industry was still good. The coal mining industry was still good. People were getting jobs, even though there was a recession in 1958. So it wasn't that much of a campaign issue. But space, the space race, because the Soviets went up with Sputnik in 1957, and closing the missile gap between the US and the USSR were two of the major issues. Then there was Kennedy being Catholic, and questions raised about Kennedy's ability to place national interests above the wishes of the Pope, because people said, well, he's just going to do what the Pope is going to do. And Kennedy explained, no, I won't. Also, age and experience. Both men were born in the 20th century. First time that happened. And both were young. Kennedy was born in 1917. I think Nixon was born in 1913, somewhere around there. So Kennedy was about 43 years old. Nixon was about 46. Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower since 1953. JFK was a senator. He and Nixon entered Washington in 1947 as congressmen. And this is probably the most famous debate in the 20th century in the United States between two politicians. It is John Kennedy on the left, is Richard Nixon on the right. It is the first Kennedy-Nixon debate in September of 1960, and it's televised. And let's talk a little bit about this debate. I had to analyze it while I was in college in 1976, and I had to watch it, and I had to listen to it because I was a communication student. And this is what I was going to do for a living, and that's what I ended up doing for a living. And I had to, it was a tale of two debates. I had to talk about what it was like on TV and what it was like on radio. And my conclusion was Nixon won the debate on radio, but he lost on TV. And why did he lose on TV? He did not look presidential. First time that would come up. And over the years, I've given this talk. There was the Atria in Stanford one day where I was talking about television and the debate. And a woman said to me, I only voted for John Kennedy because he looked good on TV. And take a look at that picture. Kennedy's wearing a suit, black and white. Remember, this is in black and white. He's wearing a suit that matches the background perfectly on TV, the black and white days of TV. Look at Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon looks like he was on the IRT on July 23rd at 5:20 in the afternoon on a day where it's 100 degrees outside with the humidity of 90%, and he is in a subway car, packed in like a sardine in the subway car with no air conditioning. And he looks, look at him, he looks all frumpy and he looks tired. And he was tired. He had a bad knee at the time. He was hospitalized actually for a day or two because he had a bad knee. And the question comes up, who looks presidential? Who raises themselves to the level of presidency, Kennedy or Nixon? Now, you got to remember, television was in its infancy in 1948. Dewey and Truman never went on TV to debate. Eisenhower and Stevenson hardly look like matinee idols, but they weren't on TV in 52 and 56. So this sets the tone. Does this person look presidential? And if you look at Kennedy, he's cool, calm, and collective. You look at Nixon, he looks like he just got off the New York City subway, a New York City subway in the middle of July during a heat wave. The Chicago debate was September 26th. Kennedy arrived in Chicago from Florida, well tanned and rested. Nixon was recovering from a knee injury he suffered in North Carolina. During a campaign stop, JFK was comfortable before the camera. Nixon was nervous, sweated profusely under the hot lights, had a 5 o'clock shadow. JFK's suit matched the backdrop at WBBM, Chicago, CBS studios. The radio listeners of the first debate narrowly awarded Nixon the victory, while the larger TV audience thought that Kennedy won by a wide margin. Appearances become really important. Nixon would learn that in the next three debates. The first Kennedy-Nixon debate changed politics. Television became a great political force because of the visuals. Now, Kennedy would win, except not everybody thought that Kennedy would win, and there was a group that tried to say that Kennedy was an illegitimate president and spread the word out there that Kennedy never won. It was illegitimate. 1960. It was a highly contested race. Kennedy wins by a narrow margin in Illinois, puts him over the top. Nixon decides, I'm not getting involved in any of this stuff. I'm conceding, it's not good for the country to have this linger on. He won, we'll move on, we'll come back, live another day. But there was a group of politicians that weren't happy, and they decided to contest the race. And most of this group were white conservative electors from the South who opposed JFK's liberal policies, especially his support for civil rights for Black Americans, the Martin Luther King phone call that got him out of jail in Atlanta. There is Kennedy and Nixon meeting one another, the 1960 election and the Electoral College. Republicans claimed there was voter fraud in 11 states. Stop me if you've heard this before. And filed lawsuits in 2 of them, Texas and Illinois, which Kennedy won by fewer than 9,000 votes. The suit in Illinois charged that the Democratic stronghold, Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago, Cook County, had dug up Kennedy voters from the cemeteries of Chicago. The judges threw out both suits. Nixon took no part in the voting challenges, told a reporter, "Our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis." But it persisted. Let's topple JFK if possible. Let's topple him. Again, stop me if you've heard this before. The electors from Alabama and Mississippi would go after the Electoral College in December of 1960. Electors from Alabama and Mississippi would not cast their votes for Kennedy, who had won both states. Mississippi's 8 electors and 6 of Alabama's 11 electors were unpledged. The electors lobbied their counterparts in the other states to aid and abet their plan. In other words, take the victory away from Kennedy, cast him as an illegitimate president, and go from there. Plan A, electors from 11 southern states, well, they would use their clout to persuade Kennedy to stop aid to communist countries and support state rights. State rights in 1960 was a code for resisting racial integration. If Kennedy refused, well, we have a backup plan. The electors would move to have a resolution. Let's reverse the position of the candidates in the election. Vice President-elect Lyndon Johnson, he'd become president. Kennedy would become vice president. That didn't happen either. How about Harry Byrd? Yeah, let's see if we can get Harry Byrd to become the president. Plan C, Republican electors from all 50 states would meet in Chicago, pick a president from a list of outstanding Southern men. The choices: Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, segregationist governors Orville Farbus of Arkansas, Russ Barnett of Mississippi, and the Georgia Senator Richard Russell. None of this worked. Nothing worked. But Byrd received 15 electoral votes for president in 1960. Unpledged electors from Mississippi, Alabama, Oklahoma cast their votes for him instead of John Kennedy. History does repeat itself. To cast doubt over Kennedy's victory and create a perception that JFK's presidency had some sort of illegitimacy, the results stood. Kennedy ended up 303 electoral votes, Richard Nixon 219, Harry Byrd 15. And this was the year that Hawaii and Alaska first started voting for president. Independence for 17 African colonies. They're looking at new leaders of countries in Africa. Again, Stewie Gates, that was my guy in 9th grade. We studied this in 9th grade in 1969. Between January and December, 17 sub-Saharan African nations, including 14 former French colonies, gained independence from their former European colonists. At the end of World War II, Africans involved in the pro-independence movements put pressure on colonial powers, which would be England and France for the most part, reminding them of their promises made to secure their support in the war effort. You give us a free country, we'll help you in the war. And the United States said, you know what, you should let them be countries. And the other thing, that these countries were draining money. And England was broke. England was poor in 1960. So let them go. Let them go. We'll save money by letting them go. And they did. The winds of change. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister back then. Harold Macmillan was a conservative British Prime Minister, and he delivered the talk to the Parliament of South Africa, February 3rd, 1960. The wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. Macmillan spent a month in Africa visiting a number of British colonies. His speech signaled clearly that the conservative-led UK government had no intentions to block the independence to many of these territories. It's going to save money by letting them go. And there is Harold Macmillan. He talked about South Africa in particular. As a fellow member of the Commonwealth, it's our earnest desire to give South Africa our support and encouragement. But I hope you don't mind me saying frankly that there are some aspects of your policies which make it impossible for us to do this without being false to our own deep convictions about the political destinies of free men, to which our own territories we are trying to give effect. In other words, get out of the apartheid business. Stop discriminating against your majority of your population with white rule. Eichmann was captured in 1960, one of the last of the Nazis that would be captured. May 23rd, 1960, the Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, announced that the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann had been captured in Argentina and would stand trial in Israel. Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer who organized Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question, was seized by Israeli agents on November 11th, smuggled to Israel 9 days later, sentenced to death. About 2 years later, he was hanged on June 1st, 1962. Getting back to The Price is Right, Bill Cullen, as we come down to the last few minutes of this thing. The United States experienced phenomenal economic growth after World War II ended in 1945. The war brought prosperity. And in the post-war period, the United States consolidated its position as the world's richest country. The business of America was the business of America, as Dwight Eisenhower or the president of GM said. That included a very strong auto industry with a vibrant steel industry. America had no competition after the war. After all, the Americans bombed everything in Germany, everything in Japan, and they're trying to rebuild their steel industry, etc. But having no competition hurts the Americans because there's no innovation. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler are just sitting on their hands. They're giving their union members money. They have the money because they have no competition. They're selling their products all over the place. But having no competition meant, hey, we don't have to work very hard and keep pushing our products. And as Japan and Germany are rebuilding, and they're rebuilding their car industry, they were coming up with a better mousetrap. And eventually that would catch up. Tell them Groucho sent you. If you remember You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx, it was sponsored by the DeSoto. I'm watching Price is Right from 1959. They're giving away a DeSoto. By 1961, production of the DeSoto ended because it was the same car as another car in that division. The auto industry was responsible for the money in the country and prosperity. It quadrupled annually its business from 1946 to 55. There was a housing boom. Levittown in New Jersey, out Long Island, stimulated in part easy, affordable mortgages for the returning servicemen who went to college and got white-collar jobs. It fueled expansion, and there was a rise in defense spending. Cold War escalated, and that played a part, and of course, there's the missile gap. The auto industry was General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, all in Detroit. Unionized automaker made a great living, and then you had the steel industry, as USS Steel, the Bethlehem Steel Company. The steel industry in the United States prospered after World War II. Between 1948 and 58, the steel mills had 700,000 workers. The steel mills were working at a furious pace. They made 40% of the world's steel in the 1950s. and then it started to end. Americans were on the move. Go out to the suburbs, buy your house. Don't stay in the city anymore. Not only that, buy a car, buy a house. Americans on the move. Fewer workers produced goods, more provided services. By 1956, a majority held white-collar jobs. Corporate managers, teachers, salesperson, office employees. Some firms granted an annual wage, long-term employment contracts, and other benefits. But there are some flaws happening. Farmers faced tough times. Gains in productivity led to agricultural consolidation. Farming became a big business. Family farms found it difficult to compete with the people who put money into farms. More and more farmers left the land, and we have that problem 60 years later. All these problems that were supposed to be solved 60 years ago still remain. The Rust Belt, General Motors, U.S. Steel, dominant. Rust Belt was an economic giant. They accounted for more than half of the manufacturing jobs in 1950. 43% of all U.S. jobs, but the Rust Belt decline starts in the 1950s because there's no competition and they had little incentive to innovate or become more productive. And there is Dwight Eisenhower and his Vice President Richard Nixon. Ike's America, the gross national product, measured all goods and services, top $500 billion. The United States was the richest and most powerful nation in the world. But America was in a recession in 1960, and the good times were coming to an end. And there is Hawaii. So number 4 years ago when I was in Hawaii, they added a state, the 50th state. Culturally, the beginning of the sexual revolution. Elvis is back. He's out of the Army, and that's him at Fort Dix in New Jersey in 1960. But he was never the same. He wasn't old swivel hips when he left the Army. Sergeant Elvis Presley is honorably discharged March 5th, 1960. He remained on reserve service, but wasn't called up again. He did 2 years. From 58 to 1960. He did return to performing. His first show was on May 12th of 1960, the Frank Sinatra show with Frank Storr and Nancy. The Silver Beatles made their debut in 1960. There is John Lennon, George Harrison, whose birthday was yesterday, Pete Best, the drummer, Paul McCartney, the bass player at that time, guitar player. The bass player was Stu Sutcliffe. 3 of them would remain. 2 of them were gone, Sutcliffe and Best, when they captured the world's attention by 1963. Silver Beatles was one of the early bands named. John Lennon wanted the name, sounded English. He wanted the Crickets, but Paul McCartney said, I think that was taken. Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Stu Sutcliffe said, call yourself the Beatles. The Beatles gave their first performance as the Beatles August 18th, 1960, at the Injured Club in Hamburg, Germany. John liked the name, but changed the spelling to Beatles and then to Beatles because it had the word beat in it. The Silver Beatles was the name that stayed with them for most of the Hamburg tour. So this is all happening real quick because Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, would win at the 1960 Olympics. A couple of weeks after the Beatles became the Beatles, he wins the gold medal in the light heavyweight division of the Olympics. So here you got on stage, the Beatles, Cassius Clay, and he would win the medal. Even though he hated flying and hated flying so much, he didn't even want to go to Louisville or San Francisco to try out for the Olympic team. And he got a parachute. He flew with a parachute in case there was some problems on the plane, so he could parachute out of the plane. And there is Ali and me in 1985, no parachute. He was an experienced flyer by that point. Oh, speaking of sexual revolution, the first Playboy Club opens. There is Hugh Hefner with the Playboy Bunnies, who served you dressed as bunnies. Back in 1960, the first club opened in Chicago in 1960. Of course, Hef had the Playboy magazine. Many young men who I know, I can't tell you if I was one of them or not, hid their Playboys when they were 12 and 13 years old, either under the bed or in between the mattresses. I've been told that. I can't prove it, but I've been told that Playboys were in between mattresses. The first Playboy club opened in Chicago, and it was a big deal. I mean, Bobby Short was there, Professor Irwin Corey, Mabel Mercer, and Mae Barnes. They were the first performers. So it's 61 years ago on Sunday. And the Playboy bunny waitresses gave out cigarettes, drinks, and food to guests, and Hef was there. The clubs would open in the United States and around the world. The sexual revolution was here. The pill. The pill was introduced in 1960, a form of birth control for women. And again, the sexual revolution starts really May 9th of 1960. The first country is the United States to legalize the birth control pill. The introduction of the birth control pill in 1960 possibly opened the door for more women to find employment opportunities and further their education. I'm going to talk more about that in 2 weeks from today with my Title IX talk about all of that. But the educational path in 1960 was extremely narrow for women until 1972, because most jobs for women were limited to becoming teachers, secretaries, nurses as a profession, or just stay being a housewife. Oh yeah, another thing, Motown. Motown starts in 1960. There is Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Barry Gordy is the founder of Motown. That starts in 1960, and they would, of course, be a major music player in the 1960s. The first hit was Money, That's What I Want. That was a Barrett Strong performance written by Barry Gordy and Janie Bradford. The talent signed in 1960, you might have heard of some of these people: the Marvelettes, Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells, and the Miracles, featuring Smokey Robinson, Bobby Rogers, Ron White, Pete Moore, and Claudette Robinson. Oh, and there was another craze also, the twist. Chubby Checker and the Twist, which was a major dance craze in 1960, 61, and came back in 1962. Hank Ballard did the original version of the song, and it was popular in Baltimore, hosted by a local DJ in Baltimore by the name of Buddy Dean. And he told Dick Clark, who is the host of American Bandstand, hey, remember American Bandstand in Philadelphia back then, and the dancers and all that stuff? There was a woman in the atria in Norwood, New Jersey, whose brother was one of the regular dancers, she told me. He got a limo to be on American Bandstand, and she had to walk to American Bandstand. Anyway, the song becomes popular with the audience, and Dick Clark, the dancers, and Dick Clark said, hey, let's get this guy on live. We'll get Ballard on. He couldn't get Ballard. So Clark is going around Philadelphia and South Jersey looking for somebody who recorded the song, and he finds Chubby Checker, whose voice is similar to Ballard. And he exposes the song on American Bandstand and the Dick Clark Saturday Night Show, and the rest is history. And Chubby Checker and the Twist, hey, and Let's Twist Again, like we did last summer, and all those Twist songs. Chubby Checker is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The song is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There I am at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm there. Chubby Checker isn't there. That was a couple of years ago. The Twist, the show is August 6, 1960. Song becomes an overnight hit. The Twist is globally accepted as a dance. The Twist and White Christmas by Bing Crosby. White Christmas and The Twist are the only two records to have ever achieved the Billboard Hot 100 #1 status 2 separate times. Chubby Checker is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but the song is honored in the Cleveland Shrine. And we finish up with Mickey Mantle, baseball and football. The last season of the 16 teams, Major League Baseball, the American League, National League, having 8 teams each. The Continental League was being formed as an alternate league. New York Senator Kenneth Keating was on board, but the National League prevents that from happening by giving expansion teams to Houston and New York in 1962, and that killed the league. The Mets franchise the catalyst in ending that circuit. The American League reacted to the National League expansion and put teams in Los Angeles and back in Washington in 1961, getting a year jump on the National League, Calvin Griffith decided to move his Washington Senators baseball team, complete with my buddy Jose Valdivieso, to Minnesota, and quickly there was another team put in Washington. There is me and Pete Rozelle, who became the commissioner in 1960 of the National Football League. That's a picture of me and Pete in 1986. Football is jolted. Lamar Hunt forms the American Football League. Pete Rozelle becomes the commissioner of that league. The league is no longer a mom and pop store. The NFL expands into Dallas. CBS gives the Bidwell family $500,000 to move its Cardinals football team from Chicago to St. Louis so they could put games on TV in Chicago. And Walter Cronkite, that's the way it is. I knew Walter, met him a few times. The violent world of Sam Huff, the New York Giants linebacker, who was on the cover of Time magazine in 1959 and was the face of pro football for a little while. There was a 30-minute CBS documentary, The Violent World of Sam Huff, narrated by Cronkite, Old Iron Pants, which provided America a close-up look at pro football. The legacy of 1960, well, Kennedy would prevail and replace Eisenhower as president. The Cold War hasn't gone away. It's still going on to this day. The 1960 presidential debate would usher in a change of culture, including how presidential candidates use television. Vietnam would become a major problem. Castro's influence would continue to grow. Apartheid would become a global issue. The sexual revolution had started. Hugh Hefner would influence many, many, many growing boys. I can't say for myself, but I can tell you about my friends who were influenced by Hugh Hefner. I'll take the fifth on that. And it was the roadmap to your lives and my lives. And by 1980, I got to be involved in presidential politics. I want to thank everybody who was here today. I want to thank Patty for inviting me. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know, because let me know. Let's talk about it. And I'm going to send this recording to Patty and whoever is